line with us is Greg Blustein. He's a political reporter with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the host of the Politically Georgia podcast, and the author of a new book, Flipped: How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. Greg, welcome to his Twitter handle, by the way, is Blustein, B-L-U-E-S-T-E-I-N, and on Twitter and on the website ajc.com for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Greg, welcome to the program. So glad to have you with us. If we could start out with, are you there, Greg, by the way?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm not hearing Greg.
I can't wait to talk.
You're hearing him? Hello? Okay.
Yes.
There, now I can hear you. Okay. Let me start out with what was the lay of the land in Georgia politics? I lived in Georgia for over a decade, but that was back in the 80s. What was the lay of the land in Georgia politics at the time that Stacey Abrams started becoming a serious force in Georgia politics?
Yeah, well, the lay of the land for Democrats in Georgia was bleak. Republicans had won every statewide office, had a commanding majority in the House delegation, both Senate seats, as well as big majorities in the Georgia legislature, almost a supermajority in the Georgia legislature over the past decade or so before things started becoming more competitive. And it was Stacey Abrams who started that process, that painstaking process of galvanizing, energizing, recruiting activists and volunteers and voters, showing them that, hey, there's a pathway forward for Democrats who want to stick to authentic messages, not just by trying to run to be a Republican-light candidates.
So was the essence of what Stacey Abrams was doing bringing up the Democratic vote among people who were not registered to vote? In other words, just increasing participation, engaging the base?
It was engaging the base in new ways, right? There was work to register voters who weren't registered, but many voters were already registered. They just felt disconnected, alienated, disenchanted with the political process. These were voters that rarely voted at all, and if they did, they voted in presidential elections, but skipped primaries and certainly skipped midterm elections. They felt like they didn't have a reason to vote. And Stacey Abrams and her allies, a network of activists and volunteers, realized that the only way to engage them, to get them energized and mobilized to vote, was not by repeating the sort of Republican-light messages that some other Democrats had. And that was the conventional wisdom at the time for Democrats to run away from national figures, to run away from gun control issues and criminal justice reform issues, and instead, talk about broad-based things like expanding Medicaid that were popular across party lines, but not lean into progressive issues. Stacey Abrams showed that there was a pathway to energize those voters by leaning into typically liberal issues that the Democrats stayed away from.
So for people who are not familiar with Stacey Abrams, where would you place her politically, and give us a little background on her, but where would you place her politically on the spectrum of, the Democratic Party spectrum of, let's say, from, Bill Clinton neoliberalism to Bernie Sanders progressive populism?
Yeah, that's a really interesting scale. I'd probably put her 7-ish in terms of liberal scale. She's very liberal, but she also has a very deeply rooted pragmatic streak. Mm-hmm. She is the former House Minority Leader of the state of Georgia, so she was the leading Democrat in the Georgia House for years. She's a tax lawyer, a businesswoman, and a political activist who has made no bones about it. She's not shy about it at all. She wants to be president one day. She wanted to be Joe Biden's running mate. She has higher aspirations than Georgia governor, but right now, Georgia governor has been her dream for as far back as when she was a teenager, and has always aspired to do so. But as I mentioned, early on, especially in her legislative career, she had a pragmatic streak. She would work with Republicans to make legislation, in her view, better. When there was a big push to cut the Hope Scholarship Award, which is a very popular scholarship, lottery-funded scholarship in Georgia that I went to school on. If you kept a B average, you got tuition paid for. When there was a push to cut that because of increasing demand and sort of flat lottery revenues, she worked with Republicans to soften the blow, and got a lot of pushback from Democrats that she wasn't more aggressive, that she would work across party lines. So even though she is this progressive and liberal icon to many, she has shown that she can work across party lines in the past.
We're talking with Greg Blustein about his new book, Flipped, How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. Greg, Georgia has a large black population. Stacey Abrams is a black woman. To what extent are the lessons that we can learn from Stacey Abrams' candidacy and the campaign and the success of her efforts, to what extent are those transportable to a state that has a very small black population with perhaps a white progressive candidate?
You know, it's a good question. I think overall, it's the authenticity of the message. The Democrats were trying to run as candidates as candidates for issues that they didn't truly engage or believe in a sense, right?
For example,
in past years. Well, you know, Democrats stayed away from gun control. Democrats were run as NRA Democrats, not because that's the way they viewed it, but it's because they thought that, and that was the conventional wisdom at the time, so I don't think their thinking was all that wrong, but they thought that in 2014 and 2012 and 2010, that if they embraced gun control, it would be a campaign ender for their
NRA would take them down.
The NRA would take them down in a state like Georgia, where NRA is still very powerful, where Second Amendment issues are still very resonant among particularly conservative voters, but even some voters who are kind of more in the middle of the road. So it took sort of that 2018 campaign from Stacey Abrams to say, hey, you can campaign on legalizing marijuana, for instance, and that's another example. You can campaign on bringing more economic equality by talking about tax cuts and tax credits for lower income Georgians, not just for middle income and higher income Georgians, but also for lower income Georgians. And then you can talk about gun control and it wouldn't be a campaign doomer right off the bat.
How does abortion play in all this?
You know, abortion is another one of those issues that Democrats in Georgia tiptoed around probably more like 2 decades ago than more recently. But Stacey Abrams and other Democratic candidates, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, have put that at the center of their campaign arguments. Brian Kemp, one of the first major legislative acts that he did was sign into law one of the most sweeping, far-reaching abortion restrictions in the nation in Georgia in 2019. It immediately got blocked in the federal court system. But even by signing that bill that he calls the heartbeat law into law, sent a message to Democrats too that, hey, this is not some squishy conservative, a moderate. This is not some middle of the road Republican. He is going to fulfill his campaign promises because he ran just as Stacey Abrams embraced the left. Brian Kemp didn't necessarily move to the middle in 2018 either. He continued to embrace the right.
Yeah. You have this whole hysteria, this moral panic that's going on right now around schools and LGBTQ people and issues, and you know, the main group that the Republicans are beating up on are trans people. But you know, now they're going. I mean, they've gone into weird land. How is that playing out in Georgia?
Yeah, in a major way. I mean, culture wars have entered the classrooms in Georgia. And I'm glad you mentioned transgender legislation, because that was the one piece of Governor Kemp's legislative agenda that I didn't think would necessarily make it across the finish line. Our legislative session just ended last week. And in the final minutes of the legislative session, lawmakers passed a measure that would ultimately would let high school officials block transgender students from competing in high school sports. So Georgia's going to, in some form or fashion, join the ranks of those other states that have taken that step. But it wasn't just that. There was legislation that would ban or seek to control how teachers talk about race and gender in the classroom. It would allow more parents say in what books should be allowed to be taught in Georgia public schools and which shouldn't. And other legislation that even sought to control how higher education, how professors taught about critical race theory and others. That legislation didn't pass, that last one I mentioned, but just the very fact that it was being sponsored or being talked about was seen to Democrats as a threat.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. The book is called Flipped, How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. The author, Greg Blustein, Bluestein, is his Twitter handle. He's a reporter with the Atlanta Constitution-Journal and the host of the Politically Georgia podcast. Greg, thanks a lot for dropping by. Great talking with you.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.